So welcome and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about my Katrina experience. My name is Mark Dixon, fondly known as Flash. I've enjoyed a 31-year career with Whole Foods Market, and my current title is President for the Southwest region. And again, it's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about the Katrina experience.
All right. So, Mark, at what point did you start preparing for Katrina to hit?
It's a good question. You know, it's interesting because when I think about the Katrina preparation experience, it really starts with you have to go back a year. And in 2004, we had a massive storm develop in the Caribbean heading for the Gulf, which was Hurricane Ivan. And we'd never really experienced anything big like that. And within a day or two of the storm forming, at that time it was on a track to hit New Orleans. And the mayor was starting to order body bags, and there was it really became this huge event. And so we actually got a little bit of practice and preparation for that. And then you fast forward, and then it missed, fortunately. And then you fast forward to Katrina. The preparation actually happened very late because the storm formed. It was barely a hurricane. It hit Florida, but it formed. It ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. And quite frankly, at the time, we underestimated the storm. I remember actually being in San Diego and having to get an emergency flight, and that was a Saturday. The storm hit on a Monday, out. And so Saturday night, pretty much 24 hours after 24 hours, we got on phone calls and conference calls and then started the preparation. Since then, we would normally prepare 3 or 4 or 5 days out the moment we have even an inkling of it, but we were a little bit late in the preparation.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost hard to imagine that something like that could happen. I mean,
well, yeah, and it's interesting because this is an important note in the process, is that I've learned over time, Southwest region being that my region's in the on the coast is no stranger to having storms come through, and it only takes one, right? It only takes one storm, and in fact, I call them teaser storms. That we'll get a series of smaller storms. We prepare, nothing happens, we get another smaller storm, we prepare, nothing happens, we get complacent, and we get caught by surprise. And that happened a couple of times. It happened all the way back in 2001 in Houston. There was a tropical storm. It didn't even make hurricane status, and it dropped somewhere in the range of 36 inches of rain in like 12 hours, and it just submerged the city, right? And it wasn't even a hurricane, so there just really wasn't a level of preparation that was needed there. And we also experienced that with Katrina. We even fast forward, we experienced that a little bit with Gustav when it came up into Baton Rouge. So,
what were the specific preparations that you ended up, scrambling to make for Katrina?
Well, any time, and this relates to Katrina, but this has really been with all the storms, is that we always think about, or my team thinks about the preparations in terms of, first and foremost, it's about securing everything, right? So it's about securing the building, securing the product, quite frankly, getting the building ready for lockdown because especially in New Orleans, generally speaking, you evacuate. You don't ride storms out in New Orleans. So we start with locking down the store, securing it. Our next priority is that team members also have to do that with their own personal property, right? And so we end up closing the stores very early, get the team members so that they can go do their preparations, and then it's just a matter of waiting it out, right? So the storm will come, and then the immediate response after that is to go in and do damage assessment, and then start the process of whatever repairs, minor or major, that we need to make. And of course, with Katrina, it was we weren't really a stranger to having to do preparation for storms, and we've done evacuations before. We just weren't expecting that level of damage that occurred there. In fact, we thought we would just get back in the day after, which we always do, and we weren't able to in the case of Katrina. So it's kind of a different story.
Yeah, I mean, after Katrina hit, Whole Foods set up a command post in Baton Rouge. When did that take place, and how did you handle the coordination?
Well, that happened very quickly. So I remember getting an emergency flight out of San Diego, and that was a Saturday, and then the storm hit on Monday. So all day on Monday, my entire leadership team, we were huddled in my office down the street here in Austin, and literally with a TV on the desk, just sort of watching the storm and the progress. And then I remember briefly having a moment of like, we're fine, right? Because the storm came through. We had just heard reports of wind damage, and we were like, well, we're fine. And then within about, I want to say about 4 hours of us huddling around the table, we started getting reports of, well, levee just breached, and then another one, and then another one. And I think there was something north of 17 levees that had breached, and the city was filling up with water. And then at that point, we realized we had a whole new level, because we thought we would just go into New Orleans. And so we made a decision. I was like, well, we just opened up Baton Rouge. That store had only been opened up like about 2 months. The Baton Rouge store is brand new. I said, it's only an hour outside of New Orleans. We need to go set up station there, because they had wind damage, but they had no flood damage. And so we rented 2 RVs, because there were no hotels. Everyone had already evacuated, did that. We rented 2 RVs. We parked them behind the store. And then we went in and set up the command. We literally took over the conference room there, so we set up the command station. And really the idea was, we needed an office to work out of. And then the order of priorities was, number one, we had to find all the team members. They were actually all over the world. We had 600 plus team members between the 2 stores, and 100% of them evacuated. And at the time, we couldn't even account for 30 or 40% of them, and there were already just nasty reports coming in about storm deaths. And so that was our first priority. We literally made a whiteboard. We were like, how many team members on each team, and every time we found one. We also brought in probably about 20 phones. It's kind of old school, and they were the cords hanging from the ceiling. And we every time team members would show up, we just put them to work, and we're like, hey, will you just answer phones? Will you call team members? And so we just sort of set up a whole command post. That's where I did meetings out of. And then every day, and it didn't happen right away, but when we were able to get into the city, we did it from Baton Rouge. We'd drive in, do what we need to do, and then drive back out.
You mentioned the RV and the phones. Were there other support stuff or equipment or supplies that you needed to get that command center going and to coordinate that effort?
Yeah, I mean, mostly the idea was we just needed an office space, right? That was really kind of the point of it. And we knew there was the reports coming back from New Orleans, they just weren't good, right? The National Guard hadn't even arrived yet in any significance, and they were at this point, they were just sealing the city down. They weren't going to let anybody in. And so we had no idea at that point what we were going to deal with. And so we our attitude was we're here to stay. We're going to be here for a while, so we need this space. We have to find team members. And then from there, I mean, we brought in a van that had, because team members were having to stay in shelters, and so we made care kits for them. And so we did it out of that room. And then just all the usual equipment in terms of protective gear, duct tape, gloves, goggles, and I'd actually even recommended, I was like, if everyone wasn't current on their immunization shots, this is probably the time to go do that, because we just don't know what we're, nasty levee water, we don't know what we're going to deal with in there. So,
how long after Katrina were you allowed to get down into the city and actually inspect the stores? And
yeah, it's interesting. It's of course in Louisiana, everywhere else we call them counties, right? But in Louisiana they call them parishes, and so the city has several parishes, but the 2 primary parishes are Jefferson Parish, which is where our veteran store is. It's towards the west side of the city. And then there's Orleans Parish, that's where downtown is, the French Quarter, and that's where our Arabella store is. And so we were able to get in fairly quickly within a few days, I want to say about 5 or 6 days, into Jefferson Parish. However, getting into Orleans Parish, at that time the guard was already there, and I mean, old school razor wire, I mean, they literally had it sealed up, and unless you were a first responder, they were not, even if you lived there, they were not letting you in at that time. And most of it was just, there was looting, and 80% of the city was underwater, right? So even finding routes so that you could get in there. So, but I want to back up a little bit, because it was one of those things where initially it was good news, but when we finally did get in there, it was not so good news. But I contacted my landlord at Baton Rouge, who has a private airplane, and I was like, is there any chance you can just fly me over the city? We couldn't get a helicopter in because rescue helicopters, they had that airspace tied up, but you could fly in at 5,000 feet. So we did get in an airplane, and we did a complete fly over the city. The Arabella store, the roof was missing. About half the roof was missing. So I assumed it was the most damaged store. We flew over the veteran store, and at least from the aerial view, it looked fine. Right? It was like, well, it doesn't look like there's any damage whatsoever. Well, we were able to get in and look at veterans first, because that part of the city, they were slowly letting people in, and it was severely damaged, and it was all flood water, but it had gotten several feet of water. And to put a context on it, we built the store, I don't know, I think it cost us about $12 million to build it, and the damage was $11 million. And it was only open, it was a brand new store, only open about 5 months.
Man, so that was your first view of it from the air, but then when you did get into the city on the ground, I mean, what were the first observations? Like, what were your first thoughts when you saw the city?
Well, there was just, I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but it was just destruction everywhere. You know, it was, cars were flipped over. One of the things, a lot of the streets in New Orleans have, well, you know, we call them esplanades, but I just recently learned that their term is, what do they call it? Neutral ground. They call the center space neutral ground. But that all the esplanades, which were a little bit higher, everyone who had evacuated took 1 or 2 cars with them, but they left cars there, and they were all parked there. But the water level was so high, so you got there, and all you saw when the water eventually receded, they got the levees plugged and they were pumping it out. You could see like all the cars were completely submerged, and you could see water lines up to buildings, in some cases up to the 2nd story part of it. So it was just severe flooding and lots of wind damage. Just, I mean, literally you'd see roofs torn off. And then mainly there's a bunch of very historic oak trees all over the city, and the branches were just shredded, you know. And so just getting, I remember I actually had a Ford Ranger at that time, and it was a 4x4, and I remember bringing a chain with me, and I chained up a couple of trees that we had to move out of the way to get to the store. So yeah, it was just, there was a lot of damage, and the water damage was just you know, that was really the thing that was unbelievable. And then the Coast Guard did this process. They literally went door to door. They checked every single building in the city over several weeks, and they had this, they would put this symbol on. They just had a spray paint can, they'd put the symbol on it, and there would be a symbol that, was it clear, was there a dead animal in there, or was there a dead person in there, right? Like, they would literally put those symbols on there so that then the rescue team would come through and sort of figure out what they needed to do.
It's kind of surreal.
Ugly. It was just it was one of those things where we went from huddled in the office, we think we dodged a bullet, the levees break, and then by the time we are able to get in there, especially when we got into Orleans Parish, which by the way, the only reason I got in there was I went to our warehouse, SWD, our distribution center, and I loaded the truck up with probably about $300,000 worth of food, because the FEMA hadn't even really gotten in there yet to feed people, and so I loaded it up with food. And when I got to the guard station, I was like, I've got food. We're going to be giving it to this company called the nonprofit called the Gumbo Crew, and they made meals for they made a couple 100,000 meals out of the food. So that's how I got in, you know, ahead of time. And then when we went to the Arabella store, no water damage. It was on higher ground, but you could just look up there, the whole center roof was gone. And Nightline actually did, that video exists somewhere, but they did a week after they were in there, and they did a whole news story, and they were inside our store, you know, because the police had actually broken doors open to let people in, because they knew the food would get thrown out anyway, and they didn't want riots. Mm-hmm. You know, so they were just like, go take the food out of the store.
So what was the recovery process like?
Well, it's a very good question, because it became clear pretty quick that if the city was ever going to recover, it was going to start with, you know, reputable businesses starting to open up, because you have to have employment, primarily you have to have food. And again, the damage was severe, right? There were no grocery stores open, no hotels. It was just an interesting scene. And so the recovery process was, number one, we need to get at least one of these 2 stores open sooner rather than later. So really a 3-step part. It was one, for the veteran store, we actually started for the first couple of weeks. It was about 2 weeks after the storm had hit. So we had started a delivery service. So that's where the command station came in play. We had all the team members there, the phone banks. You could just call from New Orleans and say, I need some steaks, I need this, I need that. Give us a credit card number, we ran it through, and every day we delivered and just dropped it off to cars in front of the store. Then eventually we built a mini store inside the store because we could do about, the store is 50,000 square feet, so we built a mini store inside, just where the floor was clear. And then that's where we sold groceries out of, and then the Baton Rouge store provided all of it. So they cut the meat there, they provided all the to-go food, and we just came and stocked it and operated it while we rebuilt the rest of the store. So there were literally, you'd go in there and shop, and there's a jackhammer going off, but no one cared. It was like, I'm just getting food. So then eventually we get the store rebuilt, and then we opened up the full store. We decided not to do any mini version at the Arabella store, right? People could just drive there. So Arabella, we just kept it shut. We didn't get Arabella opened up until February. So that was 5 or 6 months after the storm. So kind of back up, the goal was get food in there. Get, like people need to buy groceries and start restocking their houses. And interesting to note that out of the 600 plus team members that evacuated, we only ended up having about 49 return, which was a good thing because Whole Foods Market, at that time, John Mackey was like, well, let's just make sure that every city that these team members land in will forgive any budgets or anything like that. Make sure they have a job, right? And they all ended up restarting their lives in all parts of the country. To this day, I'll walk into a store in Boston or Seattle, and someone inevitably will be like, yeah, I was in New Orleans, I'm post-Katrina, I restarted my life here. So
that's pretty wild. So shortly after you had to prepare for Rita, did you do anything differently?
Well, the big, number one is that we didn't underestimate it, and fortunately, it missed us, right? And the interesting thing about the whole Rita experience, Rita was very different than New Orleans in that the images of Katrina was so vivid because Rita only came like 4 weeks later. And at least when it was in the Gulf, it made it all the way to Category 5, and it had its, the path was going right to Houston. So after seeing all the images of people staying in New Orleans and the damage that had happened, Houston panicked. Now the difference is New Orleans has about 400,000 people in it, Houston has about 5 million. So you had 5 million people leaving the city of Houston. More people actually perished in the evacuation than they did in the storm damage. And of course, Houston learned a lesson. They now have a much better idea of when you need to evacuate and when you don't. Our preparation as a company is that I take every storm seriously now, whether it's going to hit or not. We just have to assume the worst. And then if it doesn't happen, then fine, we've just practiced for another day. But assume the worst. And then the biggest destructive force inside of the New Orleans stores was mold. And it was because we left all the food behind. So we had a much better plan on how to secure the food, and we pretty much cleaned out all the outside coolers and we locked it up into either trailers or walk-ins. And then most importantly, all of my I call them the wind stores. So Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Houston, over the years we've equipped the stores with full backup generators, not just life support, but full backup generators. So they run the entire store. And so had we had power to the stores, the damage would have been less, but the food and mold. By the time I got into the veteran store, for example, the mold was crawling up 8 or 9 feet on the walls, and it was in everything. It was gross.
Has your experience in Katrina, do you feel like that's changed your personal preparedness for storms at home?
I think to some degree, because it is interesting. I'm fondly referred to in the region as the storm chaser, right? And it's anytime these events come, I literally put the leadership hat on, and it's like, okay, let's go through every process and dust off the manuals. And in some sense, it's interesting because I was born and raised in Southern California, and I found myself in Houston in 1982. And I'd never been through a tornado, a hurricane. We had earthquakes, minor. I'd never been in anything major, but so I didn't have any level of preparation. And then we got hit with a hurricane in Houston, Alicia, in one of the slowest seasons on record, right? Again, which is why my message is it only takes one storm, right? So Alicia came and hit Houston and devastated it, right? And I remember riding that hurricane out. And again, no cell phones or anything, so I had no phone service for about 2 months. I had no power for about 4 weeks, and it's just a mess, right? And it was like after that event actually is when I personally had a high level of preparation, and then most recently the Hurricane Ike was the kind of the final straw for me, just in my own house, because if a storm's coming, I'm putting on my work hat. I have to go make sure stores are taken care of, my team's taken care of, so I don't necessarily take care of what's happening at home. And the one thing I did invest in was a full backup generator in my house now. So my house is, the AC will actually work after a hurricane. So there's, to some degree, I've always had sort of that level of preparation, but Katrina really taught us some valuable and severe lessons in terms of sort of worst case scenario, and truly how important it is to prepare. Unlike a earthquake or a tsunami or anything else, in any time you have a hurricane, you have time. There's time to prepare, right? And so take advantage of that time, and don't get fooled by the fact that you have a storm or two come and it misses you and everyone's like, oh, we did all this work for nothing. It only takes one.
Yeah, and the minute you start saying, well, this one's not going to hit us, we don't have to prepare for this one, eventually the storm's going to change course and you're going to be left.
Yeah, and all that, it's interesting too, not to get too geeky on the weather, but the storms are rated, and those are all misleading, right? And I'll tell you why. If you look at historically, the 3 costliest storms in the United States would be Katrina, Andrew, that hit Florida, and Ike, of all hurricanes. And Katrina was a Category 5, made landfall in a Category 3, so very strong storm. Andrew made landfall at a Category 5, very devastating. Ike barely made it to Category 2, and yet did more damage than any other hurricane, before those two, right? And so the ratings are kind of misleading and plus I talked about Tropical Storm Allison in Houston. It's the only tropical storm in history where the tropical storm name was retired because of the level of damage it did, right? And so all of that stuff is misleading, and my approach, ever since those events is that we treat all of them seriously. It doesn't matter if it's a Category 1 or 5, and every storm's unpredictable, and they all can be, extremely damaging. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. It's certainly for the Southwest region and for Whole Foods Market, it was the most devastating natural disaster that we dealt with, and from that we've learned valuable lessons in that process, and I always appreciate having a platform to talk about. There's good lessons to learn there, and there will be another someday, and this stuff helps us prepare for that. So thanks for letting me speak about it.